Hello once again to all of you in the video audience, the listening audience, and welcome back to another lesson in this series where at What the Bible Says, we are investigating the scriptures with the mindset of the Bereans, and we are continuing in our study of this eternal messianic last days kingdom that was foretold by Moses and the prophets that it would come in the last days. And so we have been in quite a series of lessons as we have been studying from the prophets, from Moses and the prophets, and then more recently we have been looking at the resurrection, where Paul taught there in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 about the resurrection, and that being one of the promises that was associated with the coming of this kingdom and this new covenant, this new everlasting covenant where God would forgive sins, and that in this kingdom, in this spiritual kingdom, there be no death and crying and sin and so forth. And so we've been looking at these things, and now in the last few lessons we have been looking at some of the texts in the little apocalypse, which is Isaiah 24 through 29. Because Paul, and that's where we're down to in our text in 1 Corinthians 15, when this mortal puts on immortality and the corruptible puts on incorruption, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory, as Paul quotes from Isaiah 25:8. And then in verse 55 from Hosea 13:14 specifically. And so we've been looking at in previous lessons Isaiah 24 through 28, and in the last lesson I said that I thought we would go back to looking at the text and Hosea and how he applies the text there. But the more that I looked at chapter 29 in Isaiah, the more I realized that we need to look at it before we move on, because there's just several things here that are pertinent. And again, this block of prophecy from 24 through 29, this is connected repeatedly in each chapter. Again, it wasn't put in chapter divisions when Isaiah wrote, but this block of prophecy is connected from chapter to chapter by certain phrases, as we've been demonstrating, creates inclusios, for one thing, and this phrase, in that day, forgive me there, our in-house resident cat that's messing with stuff. Anyway, and so when we look at this text here in Isaiah 29, and that's where we're going to go. We're going to look at Isaiah 29, so we'll just go there. And Isaiah begins here by saying, woe to Ariel, the city where David dwelt. Add ye year to year, let them kill sacrifices. Okay, so it's kind of puzzling, I guess, to scholars and us too, who are not scholars, why that he uses this term Ariel. Well, we can speculate on that and the definition of which the word actually means lion of God, or lion-like, as it is used in 2 Samuel 23, where it says, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, the son of a valiant man of Kabzeel, who had done many acts, he slew 2 lion-like men of Moab. So there, it's the same word there. And there are a couple of variations of this word, as we'll see as we go on. But what is obvious, I guess, is what you can't get around, that is the city where David dwelt. So it's obviously he's talking about Jerusalem, as we have seen named even in the first chapter there, near the close of the first chapter, or in chapter 24, the first chapter of the little apocalypse. And so it's obvious he's talking about Jerusalem. So woe to Jerusalem, the city where David dwelt. Add ye year, and that's just year upon year, let them kill sacrifices. And it's interesting, that's what we see Paul saying in Hebrews 10 and verse 1, that the law having, present tense, a shadow of good things about to come, that's mellow in the present tense there, the King James cloaks that, and not the very image of the things, can never with those sacrifices which they offered year by year. So there's the concept there that we see here. Add ye year to year, let them kill sacrifices, and we'll look at this Ezekiel passage here in the next verse. So in verse 2 then, he says, yet I will distress Ariel. Now I want you to hang on to this. Notice that God says through Isaiah, I will distress Ariel. Okay? Now just hang on to that, because that's going to be important when we get on down in the text. I will distress Ariel. There shall be heaviness and sorrow, and it shall be unto me as Ariel. So notice again, he says, I will distress Ariel. Well, again, noticing back in chapter 24, verse 1, behold, the Lord maketh the earth empty, and maketh it waste, turneth it upside down. That's again, remember a passage we looked at, I think in the last lesson, about he would wipe the dish and turn it upside down. Same concept. Turneth it upside down, scattereth abroad, and heaviness there. Okay, so he says, and there will be heaviness and sorrow. Well, in verse 3 of chapter 24, the land shall be utterly emptied and utterly spoiled, for the Lord hath spoken this word. Then in verse 7, he says, the new wine mourns, the vine languishes, all the merry-hearted do sigh. The mirth of tabrets cease, the noise of them that rejoice ends, the joy of the harp ceases. It ceases. So they shall not drink wine with song, strong drink shall be bitter to them that drink it. The city of confusion is broken down, every house is shut up, that no man may come in. Now notice there is crying for wine in the streets, all joy is darkened, the mirth of the land is gone. Why? The city is left in confusion, and the gate is smitten with destruction. So again, Isaiah is merely recapitulating the same thing he has said in previous statements in this block of prophecy. Notice that in Zechariah later would write in chapter 12, verse 10, and I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplications. They shall look upon me whom they have pierced. Revelation 1, verse 7. They shall mourn for him, that's Matthew 24:30, as one that mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him, as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. In that day, notice, there shall be great mourning in where? Jerusalem. Okay? So again, we see the same concept there. So he says, I will distress Ariel, and there shall be heaviness and sorrow. It shall be unto me as Ariel. Now again, as I said, there's a couple of other forms of this same word. I'll show you that. So if we look at the word, it is H740, H for Hebrew, 740. Well, we find in Ezekiel 43, notice here, I'm sorry I can't make the footnote larger here. It says, so the altar shall be 4 cubits, and from the altar and upward shall be 4 horns. And notice in verse 16, and the altar, notice that is H741. All right? That also is a noun, just like H740 is a noun. It has a little bit different meaning. It has the meaning of referring to a hearth, and we actually see that, interestingly, in the Geneva translation of the Scriptures, where he says that it shall be unto me like an altar, so, or a hearth. And so, again, that's something that you can study, cross-reference, look at other places where these various words are used. But now the scholars, they, in trying to look at when he talks about having a dream down here a little bit later in the text. Because of what the scholars say, they seem to apply this to the destruction of the Assyrians, which you read about in the next few chapters of Isaiah. And I don't believe that's what he's talking about, and we'll see why I believe that as we go on down through this text. Okay, now, so he says in verse 3 then, and I will camp against thee round about, and will lay siege against thee with a mount, and I will raise forts against thee. Well, unless I missed something, I didn't know that when the Sargon and the Assyrians came against Jerusalem, that they raised forts against and raised a mount against Jerusalem. So that's one of the things that makes me think this is not talking about that incident. Okay, so now again, notice that he said, I will distress Ariel, verse 2, I will camp against thee. Who's thee? Ariel, okay? I will camp against thee round about, will lay siege against thee, I will raise forts against thee. Well, again, we see this language in, for instance, Matthew 22, the parable there in Matthew 22, where the king made a wedding for his son. And we studied that, but just as a reference, look at verse 7. But the king, when the king heard thereof, that's when they slew his son, he was wroth and sent forth his armies and destroyed those murderers and burned up their city. All right, again, we pointed this text out several times from these chapters here in the little apocalypse that Jesus is quoting and applying this idea of laying siege and raising a fort or a mount against thee. Jesus applies this specifically to the destruction of Jerusalem. In Luke 19, verses 43 and 44, the days will come upon thee as he looked out over Jerusalem and wept. He said, the days will come upon thee that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee and compass thee round. That's exactly what he's saying right here in verse 3. All right. They will lay thee even with the ground. All right. Remember that Jesus said there in Matthew 24:2, the prediction that not one stone of that temple would be left upon another. They would all be thrown down. And again, comparing that with Luke 21, when you see Jerusalem compassed or encircled with armies or army camps, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. And so again, we see the concept that is stated here in verse 3 applied by Jesus on Jerusalem in his generation. Now, you notice here again, he says that he would lay siege against Jerusalem. Well, that's what we see in Zechariah 12 and verse 2. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about, when they shall be in the siege both against Judah and against Jerusalem. And then again in Zechariah 14, verses 1 and 2, behold, the day of the Lord comes, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. I will gather all nations against thee, and that goes into verses 7 and 8 when we get down to there. All right, so then verse 4, he says, and thou shalt be brought down. Well, that's what Jesus said in the verse we just looked at in Luke 19, 43 and 44, it shall lay thee even with the ground. All right, he says, and thou shalt be brought down, and shalt speak out of the ground, and thy speech shall be low out of the dust, and thy voice shall be as of one that hath a familiar spirit out of the ground, and thy speech shall whisper out of the dust. All right, so again, same idea as in verse 3, that Jerusalem would be brought down. It would be brought down to the dust. All right, and so again, this is what we have seen back in chapter 25 and verse 12, the fortress of the high fort of thy walls shall he bring down, lay low, and bring to the ground even to the dust. Again, that Jesus quotes and applies that prophecy to the destruction of Jerusalem, Luke chapter 19. Then again in chapter 26 and verse 5, Isaiah said, "For he brings down them that dwell on high, the lofty city, he layeth it low, even to the ground, he bringeth it even to the dust." Chapter 27 and verse 10, "Yet the defenced city shall be desolate, the habitation forsaken and left like a wilderness. There shall the calf feed, and there shall he lie down and consume the branches thereof." So again, this destruction that Isaiah has been talking about time and time again. He's just recapitulating the same thing. He's repeating this over and over, using sometimes a little bit different symbology, a little bit different terminology, but again, it's the same concept. All right, so in verse 5 then, "Moreover, the multitude of thy strangers shall be like small dust, and the multitude of the terrible ones shall be as chaff that passeth away. Yea, it shall be at an instant, suddenly." So notice here what Isaiah had said back in chapter 25 and verse 5. "Thou shalt bring down the noise of strangers, as the heat in a dry place, even the heat with the shadow of a cloud, the branch of the terrible ones shall be brought low." Again, continuing the same thought that we've just read there in verses 3 and 4. And notice that he says that the strangers will be like small dust. They'll be like the chaff that passes away. Well, look at what the same idea John uses there in Matthew 3, where he said, "I baptize you with water unto repentance. There's one coming after me that is mightier than I, whose shoes I am not worthy to bear. He shall baptize you with the Holy Ghost and with fire, whose fan is in his hand, and he will thoroughly purge his floor and gather his wheat into the garner." But notice, "but he will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire." And again, we see the same concept in Jesus' explanation of the parable of the wheat and the tares there in Matthew 13. He'll cast them at the end of the age, end of the world. It was the end of the age. The angels would come forth and sever the wicked from among the just, and will cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Again, the same concept that Malachi foretold in chapter 4 and verse 1, that the day comes that shall burn as an oven, and all the proud, yea, and all that do wickedly shall be stubble. Again, same thing, same idea, same concept, just using slightly different symbols. It'll be stubble, and the day comes that shall burn them up, saith the Lord of hosts, and shall leave them neither root nor branch. And notice that he says that it shall be at an instant, suddenly. Well, this is what we see predicted by the Apostle Paul in 1 Thessalonians 5, where he's talking about the day of the Lord coming like a thief in the night. And the Thessalonians, because they knew perfectly all the times and seasons of the day of the Lord that was coming like a thief in the night, that they would not be overtaken, they would not perish. But their persecutorial Jewish countrymen, because they rejected the Messiah, because they did not know the times and seasons, because they weren't listening, they were rejecting what the apostles were teaching. Paul said, "For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them. They will not escape." And then it's interesting that we look at Revelation 18, which is the judgment of the whore, the harlot, which is Jerusalem, 3 times in this chapter. Verse 10, verse 17, verse 19. It says, "For in 1 hour is thy judgment come." Now, isn't that interesting? Well, it is to me anyway. All right, verse 6. "Thou," this is Ariel now, the city where David dwelt, Jerusalem, "thou shalt be visited of the Lord of hosts." Now again, that's the same thing that Jesus said in the Luke 19 passage. He said that they'll lay thee low, even with the ground, thy children within thee. They shall not leave in thee one stone upon another. That's Matthew 24:2. "Because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation." That's what he says here. Isaiah says, thou, that's Jerusalem, thou, Ariel, city where David dwelt, thou shalt be visited of the Lord of hosts with thunder, earthquake, great noise, storm, tempest, and fire. Well, this terminology we see all over the prophecies, and this is indicative of God's judgment. This is not to be taken as literal, although there were actually literal earthquakes. There was literal thunder and so forth that happened, and Josephus records that, and you can read there. And I was sitting in my study years ago, and there was a lightning bolt hit a big oak tree in our front yard, maybe 100 feet away. And the concussion literally shook the house. It blew dust out of the tower, my computer tower. It blew bark of that tree probably 100 feet or more. But that was just a little passing thunderstorm. That pales in comparison to the things that are associated with the judgment of Almighty God upon this nation of Israel because of their nearly 1,500-year rebellion against God and being engaged in idolatry. But again, we see this same language, for instance, in Isaiah 13:13. Therefore I will shake the heavens and the earth, and the earth shall remove out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts in the day of his fierce anger. We see this, that the idea of the foundations of the earth shook and so forth back even in chapter 24 of Isaiah, verses 18 and 19. I'm not going to read all these texts. I made the text large here so you can see all these passages, and I encourage you to stop the video and look all these passages up. And there's more, but these are just some. But you can see where this same language is used by the prophets to describe the severity of the judgment of God. And in particular, we see this same language in Joel 2, verses 10 and 11. Again in Joel 3 and verse 16, which Jesus conflates in the Olivet Discourse. For instance, Luke 21, verse 11, Matthew 24, verse 29. Again, pause the video, look those passages up, read above and below, and study. Again, we see this idea of the great earthquake and so forth in Revelation 11, verse 19. We see it again in Revelation 16, in this great battle in the Valley of Armageddon, that there was such a great and mighty earthquake. And then we see Paul used the same idea in Hebrews 12, where he said, yet once more, this word, yet once more, signifies the removing of those things that are shaken as of things that are made. Why? So that those things which cannot be shaken, that's the kingdom, the everlasting kingdom, so that they will remain. Wherefore we receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken. King James says moved. Same word, moved as shaken, and pop up to stay put there. Same word, rendered shaken as rendered moved in the two verses. And so then he says, for our God is a consuming fire, which is what the last part of this verse says, the flame of devouring fire. And we can see that idea in the next chapter, Isaiah there, the same language, the flame of devouring fire with scattering and tempest and hailstones. All right, we see this again in Isaiah 66 and verse 15. Again, read above and below. But Isaiah predicts here, for behold, the Lord will come with fire, and with his chariots like a whirlwind, to render his anger with fury and his rebukes with flames of fire. This was portending the day of the Lord coming in flaming fire, which Paul quotes verbatim in 2 Thessalonians 1, 6 through 8, verse 8 in particular there, where he would come in flaming fire, and this would be when the Thessalonians would receive relief from their persecutions that they were enduring right then. But again, we see these things here in this verse. All right, now, verse 7. And I'm going to read verse 7 and 8 together. And the multitude of the nations, okay, again, I'm going to stop. I lied to you. All right. Here's why I told you, when we look at verse 2, where God said, I will distress Ariel, which is Jerusalem. God, now notice this, God said, I will distress Ariel. But then in verse 7, it says, the multitude of all the nations that distress her. Do you see that? Do you see the concept there? God says, I'm going to do this, but then it's pointed out that it's going to be done through this multitude of nations that would fight against Ariel. Again, this is the same concept we see over and over again. When God says, I'm going to judge a particular land or nation, and they would be an army come in, whether it was Sargon or whether it was Sennacherib or Nebuchadnezzar, whoever. That would be God's judgment, and that's how God would was going to distress Jerusalem. And it was through the multitude of all the nations. Again, this is why I don't believe this is talking about, as the scholars say, the destruction of the Assyrians there when the death angel went through the camp and slew 186,000 of the soldiers there, and then Sennacherib, he went back home and then he was slain. All right, so, and the multitude of all the nations that fight against Ariel, even all that fight against her and her munitions, and that's word there refers to her forts or ramparts, and that distress her, shall be as a dream of the night. Even shall it be as when a hungry man dreams, and behold, he eats, but he awakes, and his soul is empty. Or as when a thirsty man dreams, and behold, he drinks, but awakes, and behold, he is faint, and his soul hath appetite. So shall the multitude of all the nations be that fight against Mount Zion. Now that's an interesting kind of change of thought there to me. And remembering that Paul said to the Hebrews that they had arrived at Mount Zion. So who do you reckon this could be saying here that was going to fight against Mount Zion? I suggest that this is referring to Old Covenant Israel that was fighting against spiritual Israel. Do you see that? All right. Now, again, I'm no scholar, and I suggest that if any of you have a better explanation of this text, then I'm all ears. But again, we can understand the concept. It's an easy concept to understand here, that if I go to bed hungry, I'm probably going to have a dream about eating food. But if I wake up, I'm still hungry, maybe even more so. Same thing with being thirsty. I go to bed thirsty, I may have a dream about drinking water, and I wake up and I'm still thirsty. So we can understand that concept. It's how does that apply to whatever this is being applied to, whether it's the Assyrians, which I don't believe, or whether it's Israel fighting against spiritual Israel. And so, to me, again, and I'll freely admit, this is my opinion. But again, if some of you have a better explanation, then I'd like to hear it. And I welcome the insights into that. This, to me, seems like it's indicating that Old Covenant Israel would fight against spiritual Israel, and they would lose. They would lose dramatically. It would be as if their hunger, their lust to destroy spiritual Israel so that the Old Covenant could continue, and that that's, again, I admit I have problems with this, but I do believe firmly that this does not apply to the Assyrian destruction. So anyway, you all study that, and I'll look forward to seeing your comments on that. All right, again, to nations that distress her, I just now pointed you back to verse 2 where God said, I will distress Ariel. And then again, we read Zechariah 14 there, verses 1 and 2. Verse 3 says, Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations as he fought in the day of battle. So the Lord would be fighting against Old Covenant Israel in defense of spiritual Israel. That's the concept. And again, we see the same thing in Joel 3, verses 1 and 2, of all nations being brought down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and we have studied that in previous lessons and demonstrated how that is parallel with this great battle in the valley of Armageddon, which is parallel with the great war, the war of Gog and Magog. Okay, so he says in verse 9, Then stay yourselves and wonder. Cry ye out and cry. They are drunken, but not with wine. They stagger, but not with strong drink. Now this cry you out and cry is better translated, as I have on the screen here in the modern literal version, take your pleasure and be blind. And it's interesting that we find Peter saying, of the false teachers whose judgment now of a long time lingers not, he said there in the first 2 or 3 verses in this chapter of 2 Peter 2, he says, But these, as natural brute beasts, made to be taken and destroyed, speak evil of things that they understand not, and shall utterly perish in their own corruption, and shall receive the reward of unrighteousness, as they that count it pleasure to riot in the daytime. You see that? You see the same concept there? All right, again, we back up to what we looked at in this verse in the previous chapter, in verse 15 there, where he said, Because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with hell, or Sheol, are we at agreement. Therefore, we have made lies our refuge, and we're hidden ourselves under falsehoods. Well, that's essentially the same thing that he is saying again right here. Cry you out and be take pleasure and be blind. And they were blinded because they thought they were hid behind their lies. Now notice where this goes now. For, now that shows that what Isaiah is going to say is based upon what he has just said. For the Lord hath poured out upon you, that would be Ariel, right? Which is Old Covenant Israel. For the Lord hath poured out upon you the spirit of deep sleep, and hath closed your eyes. The prophets and your rulers, the seers, hath he covered. Now notice this, please. For the Lord hath poured out upon you the spirit of deep sleep. Again, this is why, from the context, why I don't believe this is foretelling the destruction of the Assyrian army. Because we come to Acts chapter 28, notice what we read here. Saying, Go unto this people and say, Hearing you shall hear and shall not understand. And seeing you shall see and shall not perceive. For the heart of this people is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes have they closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, understand with their heart, and should be converted, and I should heal them. Do you see that? Hang on to that. Look at what Paul says in Romans 11. What then? Israel hath not obtained that which he seeketh for, but the election hath obtained it, and the rest were blinded, according as it is written. Do you see that? God hath given them the spirit of slumber, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear, unto this day. Do you see that? Paul quotes this passage right here, and he applies it to Israel of his day. Again, folks, do you see how clear that is? And he says, You have closed your eyes. Well, we can look at what Jesus said in Luke 8 and verse 10. He said unto you, and that's to the 12 disciples who became the apostles, except for Judas, of course. And he said, Unto you it is given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of God. As a side note, These were, Peter and the 11 were given the mysteries well before Paul was given the mystery. So Peter and Paul did not preach different gospels. All right. Unto you it is given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of God, but to others in parables, that, now notice, that seeing they might not see, and hearing they might not understand. Same concept as we see in our verse right here. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4:4, in whom the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine on them. All right, again, we see the same concept in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, where Paul is discussing the lawless one, the man of sin, even him whose coming is after the working of Satan, with all power and signs and lying wonders, and with all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this cause God shall send them strong delusion, that they should believe a lie, that they all might be damned who believe not the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. Again, same concept we see in verse 10 here in Isaiah 29. All right, verse 11, and the vision of all is become unto you as the words of a book that is sealed, which men deliver to one that is learned, saying, read this, I pray thee. And he says, I cannot, for it is sealed. And the book is delivered to him that is not learned, saying, read this, I pray thee. And he saith, I am not learned. Well, just as a side note, please compare that with Revelation 5, verses 1 through 9, where this book was sealed and no one could open and read it until, when you go on into chapter 6, the Lion of the tribe of Judah opened the book. All right? Now, verse 13, wherefore? All right, again, just like in verse 10, he said, for. Here he says, wherefore. So this is what he says here is based on what he has just said. Wherefore the Lord saith, for as much as this people. Well, who is this people? Well, that would be the you and her and thou, which is Ariel. Back up if you follow the pronouns. All the way back to the beginning of the chapter. All right. Wherefore the Lord saith, for as much as this people draw near me with their mouth, and with their lips do honor me, but have removed their heart far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the precept of men. Well, I know that sounds familiar to you, and it should, because this passage is quoted several times in the New Testament. For instance, in Matthew 15, 7 through 9, where Jesus said, you hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying. See, Jesus didn't say, well did Isaiah prophesy of the destruction of the Assyrian army. Jesus quotes this passage, and he said, Isaiah prophesied of you, saying, this people, that's Israel, this people draws nigh unto me with their mouth, honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, but in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. Again, in Acts 28, verses 25 through 27, and we just now quoted this passage back around verse 10. So there it is on your screen. I'm not going to read it again, but again, this is where Paul is quoting from, just as Jesus quoted from this. All right, and their fear toward me is taught by the precept of men. And apparently I have a wrong verse there, because that verse has nothing to do with this text. All right, so I made a mistake there. All right, so if we look at Colossians 2, and now we can compare this to what we just read in Matthew 15, where Jesus applied this prophecy to the Jews, and how that they, in vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrines and commandments of men, right? Okay, In Colossians 2, Paul says, touch not, taste not, handle not, which all are to perish after the using, after the commandments and doctrines of men. So here, again, Paul is appropriating this passage just as Jesus applied it to the recalcitrant Jews of that first century time frame. All right, then in verse 14, therefore, again, this is building point upon point. All right, therefore, behold, I will proceed to do a marvelous work among this people, even a marvelous work and a wonder, for the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the understanding of their prudent men shall be hid. There's probably a dozen passages already come to mind, into your mind. So let's look at a couple of them. If we back up to chapter 28, verse 21, for the Lord shall rise up as in Mount Perazim, he shall be wroth as in the valley of Gibeon, that he may do his work, his strange work, and bring to pass his act, his strange act. Now again, that's what we just read there. He was going to do a marvelous work. Habakkuk 1 verse 5, behold ye among the heathen, and regard and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days, which you will not believe, though it be told you. Now look at what we find in Acts 13, verse 41. Behold, you despisers, and wonder and perish. For I work a work in your days, a work which you shall in no wise believe, though a man declare it unto you. So do you see how this prophecy is being applied during the apostles' ministry? The wise and prudent. He says that the wisdom of the wise shall fail or perish. The understanding of the prudent will be hid. Well, that's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1, verses 19 through 24. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. I will bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. And we're familiar with the rest of the passage there. Again, this is why I don't believe this text is foretelling the destruction of the Assyrian army, because there's so much of this context that is specifically quoted and applied in the first century generation. All right, verse 15. Woe unto them that are, woe unto them that seek deep to hide their counsel. Well, remember, they had thought they'd hid themselves in their lies, under falsehoods, to hide their counsel from the Lord, and their works are in the dark. And they say, who seeth us? And who knoweth us? Surely your turning of things upside down shall be esteemed as the potter's clay. For shall the work say of him that made it, he made me not? Or shall the thing or shall the thing framed say of him that framed it, he had no understanding? In other words, why, he didn't know what he was doing. Now, again, in the very introduction to this lesson, I pointed out how that this block of prophecy is tied together with these inclusio creating statements. And right here is another one. Your turning of things upside down. That's what we read in the very first verse of Isaiah 24. Behold, the Lord maketh the earth empty, maketh it waste, and turneth it upside down. Do you see? He's still talking about the same thing. And again, in verse 18, you can see there, I have it highlighted in green, and in that day. And again, this is how this block of prophecy is tied together. And so, Acts 17 and verse 6, I found it interesting. It says, and when they found them not, they drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city, crying, these have turned the world upside down, and are come hither also. So I just thought that was really interesting. The choice of words that was used by the Jews there who were persecuting the Christians. And with the idea of the potter's clay, we see this reiterated by Isaiah in Isaiah 45, verses 9 through 11, where he says, woe unto him that striveth with his maker. Let the potsherd strive with the potsherds of the earth. Shall the clay say to him that fashioned it, what makest thou? Or thy work, he hath no hands. So again, you can see that Isaiah is repeating the same thing in chapter 45 that he says here in chapter 29 and verse 16. Woe unto him that saith unto his father, What begettest thou? Or to the woman, What hast thou brought forth? Thus saith the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, and his Maker, Ask me of things to come. Notice that. Ask me of things to come concerning my sons and concerning the work of my hands, command ye me. So look what we find Paul saying in Romans chapter 9. Thou wilt say then unto me, Why doth he yet find fault? For who hath resisted his will? Nay, but, O man, who art thou that repliest against God? Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, Why have you made me thus? Hath not the potter power over the clay of the same lump to make one vessel unto honor and another unto dishonor? Do you see that, folks? Do you see how Paul is applying Isaiah 45 and by parallelism Isaiah 29:16 to the Jews of his day? But wait a minute. Hang on a minute. Isaiah 45 is dealing with the salvation of all Israel. Verse 17. But Israel shall be saved in the Lord with an everlasting salvation. See that? But look at what Paul says in Romans 11. Verse 25, For I would not, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And so all Israel shall be saved, as it is written, There shall come out of Zion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant unto them, when I shall take away their sins. So again, folks, through parallelism, what we read here in verse 16, and reiterated in chapter 45 of Isaiah, Paul is applying that to his ministry as in the course of being fulfilled during his ministry as this new covenant is being made known. But wait a minute, let's keep reading in Isaiah 45. Look unto me and be ye saved, all the ends of the earth, for I am God, and there is none else. I have sworn by myself, the word is gone out of my mouth in righteousness, and shall not return. Notice, please, that unto me every knee shall bow, every tongue shall swear. Surely shall one say, In the Lord have I righteousness and strength, even to him shall men come, and all that are incensed against him shall be ashamed. In the Lord shall all the seed of Israel be justified, and shall glory. Again, in Romans 14, Paul says, But why dost thou judge thy brother, and why dost thou set at naught thy brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. For it is written, As I live, saith the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, every tongue shall confess to God. So then, every one of us shall give an account of himself to God, which is what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10, For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that every one may receive the things done in his body, according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad. Again, in Philippians 2, Paul says, Wherefore God also hath highly exalted him, Christ, given him a name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of things in heaven and things in the earth and things under the earth, that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father. And there are so many people today that will go to Philippians 2, 9, and 10 and say, well, now because every human on the planet has not physically bowed down and put their physical knees on the ground in obeisance to God, and because they have not confessed with their tongue that Jesus is the Lord, and so then this cannot be fulfilled. This is something yet in our future. No, friends. that is total ignorance of the context of these passages that is specifically applied to the salvation of all Israel. And Paul said that all Israel would be justified through the remnant. I don't have those passages at hand. We've looked at them in the previous lesson. It would be through the remnant. And Paul specifically said, very clearly said, even now at this present time, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. That was being fulfilled right then in the first century during the apostles' ministry. And through parallelism and all these passages I've just shown you here, this is parallel with what we read in verse 16 of Isaiah 29. Verse 17, is it not yet a very little while, and Lebanon shall be turned into a fruitful field, and the fruitful field shall be esteemed as a forest. And here's where the futurist will jump in and say, aha, we've got you. Because this says, for yet in a very little while, and what you're saying was not to take place for several hundred years later. Therefore, you cannot interpret the at-hand statements the way you do. Well, no, folks. Sorry. That does not work. Because the very next verse says, and in that day. In what day? It was in the day that God would distress Ariel. This was not in yet a little while in Isaiah's time. This is projected into the future of when these things would begin to be fulfilled. Then it would be yet a very little while. And that's exactly what we find in Hebrews 10 verse 37. For yet and the King James Version doesn't capture the full thrust of this time statement. It is for yet a very, very little while. And he that shall come and will not tarry. But yet, futurists have him tarrying some 500 years longer than the entire length of the Mosaic Age. That's why that idea is absurd. And so verse 18, and in that day shall the deaf hear the words of the book, and the eyes of the blind shall see out of obscurity and out of darkness. And time forbids for us to examine quite a number of passages where we can see that. One will suffice in Matthew 11 verse 5, where Jesus told the men that came to him from John, and they were to go back and report to John, who was in prison. Jesus said, well, this is what you tell John. The blind, tell him what you see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And again, we could cover a multitude of passages throughout the Gospels and into the book of Acts where all of these miraculous healings took place. But there's no need, because you know those as well as any of us, regardless of your paradigm. You know that Jesus did all these things that we just read, for instance, there in Matthew 11, and that Peter and John healed, that Peter healed Dorcas, and Paul raised Eutychus from the dead, and so on. We see those things taking place in the first century. And so, again, this is why that I didn't want to skip chapter 29 of Isaiah, because there are just so many nuggets in this chapter that correlate to what we have already read in chapters 24 through 28. And again, how those things and how these things are applied, quoted, cited, echoed, and applied during the ministries of Jesus, as well as the apostles through the fall and destruction of Jerusalem. And so I hope that you can see these connections that we have pointed out here. And we're going to end our study, obviously, right here. And I want to thank you again for your time. And please don't forget to like the video and to share this video out to others. If you're new to this series, please go down there and hit the subscribe button and the little bell icon. And that way you'll be notified when we upload a new video. And then go back and study the previous videos in this series to bring you up to our current study of this last days kingdom and the promises that were associated with the coming of the last days kingdom. So we're going to stop here, and until our next lesson, I pray that God will bless you richly in your study of His Word, and you have a blessed day.